Good morning. Before I introduce today's first session, which is the power of digital media to shift the narrative, Les asked me to say a couple of things because I was probably one of the first people to utilize the power of social media. And that was 12 years ago, so I'm what you would call first generation social media. I know very little about today's social media, which these guys are going to share with us. But I can tell you that even then it was powerful if you really knew how to use it. I used it to put 200 people in front of a city hall. I used it to put 300 people at a prayer vigil. And eventually I used it to create enough pressure to put me in the BIA office in Washington, D.C. So really listen to what these guys have got to say today and embrace the power of social media. Our panel today consists of Michael Clauw, Director of Communications and Gambling Research Lead at Campaign for Accountability. Michael's from Washington, D.C., and as Director of Communications and Gambling Research Lead for Accountability, Michael investigates and exposes how online gambling companies design addictive products and fight consumer protections. He leads groundbreaking research that holds the industry accountable. Our next panel member is Rob Minnick, who we've met yesterday. He's a gambling addiction recovery content creator from New Jersey. He placed his last bet in 2022. He's a Georgetown graduate and has become a full-time content creator, reaching over 15 million people each month, using his story of addiction and recovery to guide and inspire young adults. We also have Matt Zarb-Cousin, leader of Clean Up Gambling in the United Kingdom. He's one of the world's most influential gambling reformers. He leads the UK's Clean Up Gambling campaign, co-founded the pioneering blocking software Gamban, and has driven landmark policy changes, including slashing maximum betting machine stakes from 100 pounds to 2 pounds. Our moderator today is going to be Stroup from Colorado, and she is Stop Predatory Gambling's Director of Strategy and Campaigns. So thank you.
Well, good morning. It's so good to be with you all. This is a great panel. They are all communications gurus, and I think what we'll talk about here has good application for whether you are an advocate, an activist, or a journalist, or somewhere in between. Because anytime you're talking about this issue, I think the communications tips and tools and tricks that these folks have will be extremely helpful. My background is I have like a mutt type of career. So I started off in elementary education and then went to law school and have a legal background. I am a recovering lobbyist, like some in the room, and also have done a lot of policy work and been an executive at a nonprofit where communications is key. So there's a lot of tips and tricks and the trade here, and you'll probably see some of my elementary education background come through here this morning. So with that, we will jump into it. But to start off, and sort of what we learned in the communications realm, and when I had a call with each of these gentlemen to talk about this panel, what they all sort of shared is that how you deliver the message and who's telling the story really matters. And there's no better way to illustrate that instead of just talking to you than showing it to you. So we're going to do that first.
911, what's your emergency?
Hi, I've been in a car accident. My car slipped. There's water getting the car, and I can't get out.
911, what is your emergency?
I came out paddleboarding, and a hard wind is pushing me out to sea.
Okay, do not hang up.
911, what's your emergency? I'm here at the farm. I broke my leg straight down 21 feet. I sure need help quick.
Are you by yourself?
Yes.
Have you tried to get out? Have you tried to bust the window or something?
I'm pretty far out in the ocean. I can't get to my cell phone. I'm talking on my Apple Watch.
Try to keep talking to me.
Okay.
I can't fight the wind anymore.
It's getting deeper. It's getting to my neck.
Please hurry. I'm hurting real bad.
You're going to seek help, okay?
I see them.
They're opening the door.
Hold on. Are you in an air pocket?
I'm just at the driver's seat.
Okay, so your head is above water?
Yes, sir.
How many of you knew that was going to be? How many of you knew that was going to be for an Apple Watch? No clue, right? So this issue obviously has nothing to do with gambling, that video. But I wanted to show you that to help contextualize what we're going to be talking about. So The power of media. I think the first thing you saw in that video is the issue framing. So what was and we want this to be, I think our panel and I, we really want this to be interactive. So issue framing, how did they frame the issue there, or what they were selling? Obviously it's a product, it's different than an idea, but what were they selling, the Apple Watch? But they framed it as an emergency situation, right? That was their message framing. And then the messaging matters too, the talking points that you use and how you talk about the issue. So there were people who couldn't reach their phone. There were people who needed help quickly. It was urgent. That was their messaging to get you to think about buying an Apple Watch. Now, I am a late technology adapter. I was probably one of the last to join Facebook. I sort of begrudgingly transferred to Instagram, like I get it. But even this, I'm like, man, I need an Apple Watch. Like, what if I was with my kids, you know? Like, it actually got me thinking about an Apple Watch. So the messenger matters. In the video, who was the messenger? Yes, real question. The victims, the voices of the victims, that's right. And those were, as you saw, real life situations. What you make your audience feel matters. So as you're watching that video, you feel scared, you feel worried, you're thinking about your loved ones, like, oh my gosh, what if that was my kid? I need to get my kid an Apple Watch. You know, you're feeling all these things. And then how you deliver your message matters.
Just saying, don't get your
No, don't do that, but you feel like you should do that. That's a different issue, Michael.
Yeah.
I'm with you on that one too. And then how you deliver your message matters. So likely this ad probably aired on social media, probably showed up on people's Instagram feeds, people who are more inclined to get that technology anyway, so they're targeting their audience with the right message delivery. So let's go back to the issue framing and messaging. So Rob, let's talk about what type of framing does not work well on the gambling issue. It's probably easier to rule out what doesn't work well first.
Yeah. So when I got into recovery, I didn't quite know what I wanted to do with my life. And I ended up making TikToks. And now we're here talking about social media. So I didn't grow up a social media expert, but I did become a gambling addict. And so I definitely know what resonated with me and what didn't resonate with me when it came to gambling messaging. And I remember, like, the very first conference I ever went to was the Delaware Council for Problem Gambling's conference. And I love the guy that runs it, Jeff, but the thing about the affiliates of the National Council on Problem Gambling is they're all sworn to gambling neutrality. So they don't have a stance for or against gambling. And when I went into this event and a sponsor on the thing was FanDuel, it immediately changed how I perceived everything that we talked about that day, regardless of everyone's intentions, regardless of how good the content actually was. And then when I started to see the kind of messaging that they would put out, not just the Delaware Council, but all the affiliates on socials, it became a little bit like it didn't have a bite to it. And what I found was it was a lot of cold clinical information about, you know, this is the rate of gambling addiction, so pay attention to it, not why should I care. And I'm sure throughout this panel we're going to talk about a piece that Matt was so gracious to sponsor on my channel, where we did a 6-part documentary series asking the question, what will happen to gamblers in America if nothing changes? And admittedly, we spent a ton of time working on it. And I think it came out really well, but it fell on deaf ears. And when looking at it in retrospect, what we realized, and you had it up there on the slides, I didn't frame it as a story. And because I didn't frame it as a story, it lacked this human element that when we would post a full-length interview from the documentary, it would outperform the documentary. And all it was someone telling their story of addiction and recovery. And so the long answer to your question, what works versus what doesn't work, is when we humanize the issue, it immediately gets people's attention. But when we try to present facts or, you know, things that you might present to a legislative hearing even, the general public won't really resonate with it unless you are able to lead with a story.
That's so good. That's so good, Rob. I've seen that play out time and time again on multiple issues. So this isn't just in the gambling front. It is across the board. And like I said, this applies no matter what type of communicating you're doing, whether you're just talking to someone about the issue, whether you're creating content, whether you're creating talking points to use a legislative hearing, or whether you're talking or presenting or pitching to the media. And so with that, I will turn to you, Michael. In your role, you were frequently pitching to the media, trying to get them to cover the story, hopefully from our perspective. So in that role, what have you found works best in terms of framing the issue for the reporter?
Yeah, so my interest and expertise in my role versus, Rob is trying to capture like the sort of eyeballs of the public. I'm more interested in like the attention of reporters, mostly in the traditional media, as you would understand it, not so much like social media influencers, at least not yet. And I think it's like easy for us working on this issue to like think or hope that when like we know how bad of a problem this is, we know how much attention it deserves. So it's sort of easy, I think, to think or hope that if we just present that to a reporter and have a conversation with them, that they'll see what we see, and then as a part two, decide that it's like, oh, my readers need to know this information as well. And I think often like we're successful in the part one and can get, people to empathize and understand that this is a really big problem, but then we get frustrated when it's like, okay, but why don't they write a story about this? Like, why is this just like a conversation that doesn't lead to any sort of output from them? And I think like in the most empathetic, non-cynical way, like I think it's just very important to, in those cases, like remember the reporter's self-interest, like in their job, like what they need to do. They have thousands of potential issues that they could cover on any particular day. And I think it's incumbent on us to think about ways that like we can make their job, not only make their job easier, but make them look good. And usually in my experience, that comes in the form of like, what sort of like new piece of information can I give this reporter that their colleague doesn't have? Like we call them like scoops or exclusives or what have you. And, in my role as a communications director, a lot of my work is, trying to amplify the research of my colleagues. But I have sort of also decided like that, when there's no news to promote, it's also my job to create some of that news. And so when it comes to this issue, like, I can go into more examples later, but like, everybody here has the tools to basically like compile open source research or work product that you can hand to a reporter that reporter's colleague might not otherwise have, that, gives them that little scoop or that advantage that they can bring to their editor and say like, hey, this is something novel that we can bring to our readers, apart from like, the same kind of story that, maybe that their readers haven't heard, but like the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal has covered this issue, and they're trying to think of like, what new angle can I have on this? We heard from a reporter just yesterday who, when he said it, I like quickly wrote it down because like of evidence that he was saying, do you have an agenda? Like someone was asking him, like, do you have an agenda as a reporter? And his exact words were, yes, I want my story to be at the top of the front page of tomorrow's paper. That's my agenda. And it's like, when I heard that, I was like, okay, it's not just me who's like suspecting this. It's like, everybody's human. Everybody has like an interest in doing their job well. So to the extent that anybody, like whether it's like filing a FOIA in your local state to try to get just a little nugget of information that you can hand to a reporter, or like just this morning I was reviewing some work that we'd done, and I was reading over information about like how calls have increased to helplines, and I was like looking at data for one state, and I was thinking like, I don't know that I've ever seen, and forgive me if someone in this room has done this work, but I don't know that I've ever seen like a 50-state cataloging where someone's put together a report where it's like, here's every single state. Like most states report that have call lines report their numbers. It's like, I don't think anyone's ever compiled a report that it's like, here are all the states, and then like compare the states against each other. Here are the states that are doing the best and the worst. And it's like, you've seen some reporting where they've mentioned calls going up and comparing different states, but like as a sort of like piece of work product from folks that are interested in this issue, that's something I haven't seen. And like It's a free idea if anyone's interested in doing that. It's like just sort of like open source research ideas like that, where it's like compiling a piece of work product, handing it to a reporter, and then using that as an opportunity to insert into that article all of these important points about all the harms and like stuff that might have been, you know, reported elsewhere, but it's like having that new piece of information is an opportunity to remind people of all the harms that we already know.
That's good, Michael. And I think what he's saying applies absolutely when you're talking to the media, but also, you know, if you think about talking about this issue or presenting in some other context, it is always good to bring in something new or a different angle or something that somebody's never heard before. Think about what you have to offer that's unique, that's not already out there. So Matt, we've talked about framing the issue around victims, survivors, and those in recovery, hearing their voices because they are important and they are powerful. But you talked about another way to frame the issue that I think is also powerful, and it's just a good reminder no matter what issue you're talking about, and that is who's the bad guy in this? And I think it would be helpful if you would talk a little bit about that way to frame it.
Sure. So people always say journalists, the media loves human interest, but they never really, so like stories about individuals and people, and they never really talk about why that is. And the reason for that is, I think that Michael was touching upon it, is you can't simply give a piece of information or facts to a journalist and say, can you write a story on this? It has to be new, so they're news reporters, new information. And the human interest component short circuits that, because what you can do then is say, the story is about this thing that's been happening for ages, happening to this person, and that's what happened recently. That's the new bit of information. So the human interest, the case study, is your way in. That's what makes it news. And then once you've got that case study, so in the early days of our campaign on the betting machines, I was the case study, and the journalists would say to me as a campaigner, have you got anyone that can talk about this? And I would say, well, I can talk about my experience of addiction to the machines. And I would do so, and I did so hundreds of times on the broadcast media, in the press, like again and again, talking about this, my addiction. But it wasn't about me, and the questions the journalist, you know, I had to be in the story for it to be news. But the questions the journalists were asking were about my addiction, but I would always pivot to why I got addicted. And I got addicted because the machines were addictive, and because they were offering stakes of £100 a spin, and they were, you know, in easily accessible venues, and all these kind of factors. And then I would say, if the machines were limited to £2 a spin, like every other machine, I don't think I would have got addicted to them. I wouldn't have experienced the level of gambling-related harm that I experienced. I would then foreground what the solution is in terms of policy. So I would go on breakfast TV and be, you know, interviewed about my addiction, and then I would very rapidly pivot to talking about the policy. And equally, I think it's very, very important to contextualize gambling-related harm as arising from commercial determinants. So things that the gambling industry, the products, the practices that they engage with, how that is driving gambling-related harm. Keep talking about the gambling industry. If you don't talk about that, if you just talk about, I got addicted to gambling, this is my recovery journey, and you make it all about you, and you know that just lets the industry off the hook. That's then not talking about policies or advancing policy positions that could prevent harm in the future. And so the media wants the human interest story. That's what makes it news. But I think it's so important to have advocates that are able to pivot in that way, to talk about the broader issues, not just your addiction.
Matt, following up on that, yesterday the attorney Matthew Litt was saying that when he's framing his issues, he doesn't believe that it's 100% on the industry, doesn't believe it's 100% on the gambler. How do we as like people in recovery or people speaking to the media, not just like immediately throw everything onto the casino as the problem.
Yeah, no, I don't think it's credible to do that either. I don't think it's credible to sort of say it's not my fault at all. I had to take responsibility for my recovery, otherwise I would never have quit gambling. But I think it's really, really important as someone who got addicted to gambling and who then recovered to say that what caused my addiction was a combination of factors, and some of those factors are things that we can change. And I think that that's the way to go about it. I mean, we did some focus groups recently in the UK, and people are so like contradictory in their views. So on the one hand, they think that people are responsible for, gambling within their means and not exceeding their, what they can afford to lose. And on the other hand, they also think the operators have a responsibility to ensure people don't lose more than they can afford. So it's really about what you make salient. People don't really have if you make a compelling argument, then people can very, very easily be won over.
That's really good, and Rob, I'm glad you asked that follow-up because that's important too. And the media, I think, and just in general, people always want to know who's the problem, who's the bad guy. So be thinking of that whenever you're messaging and helping people understand, like, this is a problematic product from its very nature, from its core, and then being able to talk about what those solutions are. But that's actually a perfect segue to my question to Michael, because this product and the industry is treated so differently from other products that we know are addictive or that we know are harmful. And of course, the gambling industry itself paints itself as an entertainment thing. That's their messaging, that's their framework. This is a form of entertainment, and therefore you are responsible for your own entertainment, just like you are when you buy a movie ticket. That's how they frame this issue. And so it's handled very differently by the industry, and it's therefore perceived very differently by the audience, which is a problem for us as communicators. So Michael, I think if you could talk a little bit about why this product, this harmful product, is perceived differently by the general public, and then how do we overcome that in our messaging?
Yeah, so you mentioning movie tickets made me think of one sort of anecdote, and then I'm going to come back to a big tobacco metaphor. So I was talking to somebody who said a line that maybe some of you have said or heard that they credited to Harry Levant. So I didn't come up with this, but basically that if someone's talking about gambling as entertainment and then like they're talking about these like no sweat bets, it's like if you think about that statement alone is like, I think Harry Levant's line is like, the only person who sweats a bet is someone with a gambling problem. And like comparing that to entertainment, where it's like, imagine a movie ticket being advertised to you. It's like, no sweat movie ticket. It's like, you don't have to worry about the consequences of you going to this movie. Unlike most movies you go to, like there's a risk of you going to this movie. And so it's just like, that advertising alone is crazy. So I just wanted to say that. In terms of the framing, in another panel I was talking about sort of like how I like to think of it in relation to big tobacco. I think is like a good comparison just to like hold when talking about a lot of these different things. I was at a wedding a couple weekends ago, and it was like a very splashy wedding in New Jersey, and they had a cigar rolling station, and there was like looked like 75-year-old man who he looked like he'd been doing this his whole life, sitting at a booth, like hand rolling these cigars with like these beautiful looking like tobacco leaves, and giving them out to people. And not an ounce in my mind had I look at this guy and think like, oh, this is a bad guy. It's like, this is just like a sweet old man rolling cigars for people at this wedding. And thinking about it afterwards, it's like, okay, so in my mind, it's like, why do I see big tobacco as like the enemy and evil? And why do I see this sweet old man as a sweet old man just like providing a service and rolling cigars for people? And I think it's because like with the big tobacco industry, I think I mentioned this on a panel, it's like I had that education of like like, no, these are not just people who are plucking tobacco out of the ground and rolling it up and serving it to you like artisan style. Like, they are injecting like ammonia and arsenic and tar and all of these, like, making all of these conscious choices to make their product like far, far more harmful than it already is. And I do think that with gambling, the public currently has a kind of perspective where they're like, yes, gambling is a harmful activity, so like, they probably shouldn't be advertising it so much, because people are used to not seeing tobacco advertisements in the same way. And they're like, yeah, they probably shouldn't be advertising it so much. Smartphones are, I'm addicted to this thing, so like, it's probably bad that gambling is accessible 24 hours a day on the smartphones. And then I think that's about where it sort of ends for most people in terms of like what they see as like the problems of gambling. It's like, the ads are bad, probably shouldn't be on the smartphones. But it's like, I do think just like the narrative and the work needs to be done to like describe those additives and ingredients that like, you know, illustrate the difference between the artisan cigar being rolled and the big tobacco, and explain to people why DraftKings is the latter and not the former.
That's good. And speaking of perspectives, I think there is a different perspective between how we, and all of us in this room, perceive the gambling industry as activists and advocates versus how the public does in terms of morality. I know Les talked a lot about morality and in the issue yesterday. Rob, do you want to cover that one?
I would say that the general public, like trying to pick like age brackets to define them. So I'll say like an 18 to 30-year-old population. They think gambling is really cool. If you quit gambling or for some reason you're addicted to gambling, that means you're a bad gambler, because this is a product that is being provided that you can theoretically get better at. And I think that the lack of explanation that you're supposed to lose is like, it's mind-boggling how the industry gets away with it because of being classed as entertainment. Like, if you look at a commercial for like Charles Schwab, like you'll see this big disclaimer at the bottom that, you know, if you invest money in this ETF or this brokerage account, like you could lose your investment. It's obvious, and people seem to know that on average, but it's like, okay, like that reminds me like this is money that's at risk. Whereas with the gambling, it's like people are watching a commercial of fireworks going off, Jamie Foxx swinging in a suit telling them that if they gamble, like we're gonna give you free money and it's gonna be awesome. And then it says like, hey, like if you are one of those like losers, then you can call us like at this number. And everyone else, you're gonna have a great time. And so when I post like social media content, especially towards the apps that are geared towards younger audiences, so TikTok and Instagram, the comments are outrageous. And the comments are essentially like, I'll post like, yeah, it's been 1,000 days since I placed a bet. They're like, oh, well, that's because you sucked. I don't suck. I'm not going to be like, you loser. And, and then like 2 weeks later, I'll get a message, hey, I actually lost everything. Could you give me the number for that rehab that you work with? Like it happens all the time. But, you know, in the generations after that, like say like 30 to 50, the perception is gambling is a moral issue. So if I messed up for some reason, they're like, well, don't tell me what I should or shouldn't do because you couldn't control yourself. And I'm like, I'm not, but you jump to that conclusion. And then past that, you know, I don't get a lot of engagement from the 60-plus community on TikTok. But if anyone's in that community, would love to have you join. But I would just say, like, it's been painted in such a way that if you're losing, you are the problem, when in reality, that was the inevitable outcome.
If I could jump in, one of the most as someone from the outside, one of the most like radicalizing single statistics that I saw, I think it came from an NCPG survey from like 2021 around then, but it was like when they asked people the question of is like online gambling a good or great way to make extra money, people aged like 50 and over, 0% of them said it is a good way to make extra money. And for people like 18 to 24, 18 to 30, I don't know the exact number, it was about like 50% or something around that said it is a good way to make money. So just like radically different perceptions.
We had a study that came out last week in the UK called the Gambling Survey for Great Britain. It was a second iteration of that. And in looking at motivations for gambling, 85% of people gamble because they want to win money. I know it sounds like an obvious thing, but if you listen to what some of the gambling corporations say, Jason Robbins is a great example at DraftKings, saying our product is not for people that want to win. They're quite open about the fact that this is the people, their customers, they say, are buying entertainment. That's their narrative. But actually, their customers don't believe they're doing that. Their customers believe they're trying to win money. So either they don't understand their own customers, which I think is highly unlikely, or they project a particular narrative to policymakers that makes it more acceptable, more palatable politically, what they're engaged with. If people are trying to win, if 85% of people in the UK gamble because they want to win money, 99% of people lose. So conveying exactly what Rob said, conveying the fact that it's basically impossible to win unless you're Isaac, but then even even he has trouble getting his money on, right? So it's basically impossible to win. If you get an edge over the bookmakers, they'll close or restrict your account. You're never going to win long term playing slots and casino products. So I think that's a really important message, to try to suppress participation. I think even if we don't get policy change, I think we have to advance this narrative as best we can, social media and mainstream media, that not only is gambling addictive, but it's basically impossible to win. And one of the things we did in the UK with the betting terminals is we described them as the crack cocaine of gambling, and that was a narrative that a label that the media picked up on, and all the newspapers were referring to fixed odds betting terminals as the crack cocaine of gambling. It was a very, very helpful way of framing a particular product as being addictive, and that some gambling products are more addictive than others. So I think that there are two things I would say. The first is, I think, put the onus on the product being addictive, and the second thing is reinforce this idea that it's impossible to win, because that is basically true.
And one point that I had missed that Matt just reminded me of is, like, we're not saying that this product is addictive, so we're not labeling gambling commercials with something like you would see on like a cigarette packet that would say like this contains XYZ, that could, like, similar to your expression about why cigarettes versus cigars come across differently. But like the CFTC, I believe it is, regulates financial advertisements, or is it the FCC? I get confused with acronyms, but FTC. So who regulates the gambling advertising? Themselves. So they say, oh, we're doing everything that we can within our power to make sure people don't get addicted. Okay, like who's gonna prove that? There needs to be if we're going to make progress, there needs to be some sort of regulatory body that can come up with brand standards for what these companies can and can't say in their commercials. Because right now, people are led to believe they're going to make money.
Rob is teasing up a new resource we have coming out. You guys will get the first sneak peek at it in one of the sessions later, that compares the gambling industry to other industries like the tobacco industry that are highly regulated, that I think will be pretty powerful. So we'll give you a sneak peek later. So we've spent the bulk of the time on framing the message and the messaging, because I think that's super important. Obviously, that's where the substance is. You have to build that in order to create a powerful story, get something in the news, win the argument against whomever. And then I also want to spend a good amount of time on the message delivery before we close. So the two things in the middle, the messenger and then what your audience feels. I'm not going to spend as much time there. I'll just say, for the sake of time, what your audience feels, no matter who you're talking to, or whether it's the media, or whether it's digital content creation, or a resource you want to get out, or you're arguing in front of a legislative body, you do want to ask yourself, how do you want people feeling when you're done with presenting whatever it is? Do you want them to be angry at the industry for what they've done? Do you want them to have this righteous anger about what's been happening, or about the person who's been harmed, and they want to do something about it? Like, what do you want to make them feel? That should be the question that's in your mind when you're framing things. And then the one question I'll ask the panel, I'm going to go back to you, Matt, on the question of the messenger. Matt, you and I spent a good amount of time talking about that and actually training up people to be really good messengers and the importance of that. Can you touch on that a bit before we go to message delivery?
Yes, absolutely. So I think in treatment, there's a lot of focus on obviously individuals recovering from addiction and taking responsibility for that recovery. That's super important. No one's going to recover from your gambling addiction for you. You've got to take responsibility for that. But then I think there's a space in recovery for education about why you got addicted, what the commercial determinants of harm are, the process of addiction. It is a process. That's what happens. It's almost like a learned behavior, I think. They try and condition you to become like a habitual gambler. And understanding that and the mechanics of it is very, very important. Not just because it reduces the stigma that people feel. If it's addiction by design, then you don't feel like it's, you're the problem, or that this has actually been done to you, which I think is very important. Reinforces, I think, recovery and abstinence. But also because then you want people to become advocates, or if they want to become advocates, you want them to ensure that they understand that. And it's not just about their own quote-unquote faults as an individual. That's why they got addicted. It's because of the practices of the industry. And so we have some excellent charities in the UK, Gambling with Lives. Obviously, they focus primarily on bereaved families bereaved by gambling suicide. There's also organisations called GamFam and GamLearn, and these are focused on educating affected others and people that were obviously in recovery on why they got addicted. And when they do then speak to the media, they understand the issue, they understand it much better, and can talk about the industry and can talk about what needs to change in an authentic way. And that's, I think, extremely important work, because, I mean, I can't do that anymore, that kind of advocacy where I talk about my lived experience, because I got addicted to machines that really effectively no longer exist. So you always need new people coming through to take up that role if you want to drive change. And there's plenty of people out there who are getting addicted to gambling, unfortunately. So lots of potential advocates. And so that's something that I think that's super important.
That's really good, Rob. Super important. I've worked with victims or survivors in other contexts too, and it is so important to help them be trained and ready to go, because the media, certain members in this room exempt from that, the media can be vicious, it can be a hard thing, or even just going in front of a legislative body and to not just throw people out there when they've never done that before, but to have them prepared to talk about the issue too. So I do want to close out with talking about message delivery, because of course if you have the best issue framing and the best messaging and the best messengers in the world, but you can't get your message out, that's a problem. Rob, you are the obvious person to start with. Let's talk a little bit about getting your message out through digital channels. Can you give us a few tips and tricks of the trade?
Sure. I would say that because of the fact that social media influencer has become like a job that a lot of kids want, there's never been a time where it's more competitive to try to make organic social media content actually get eyes on it online. And what I mean by organic is like when you're not paying for an ad placement on someone's feed through a TikTok, a Meta, or a Google. And so that's not to say that it can't be done, because it absolutely can. People go viral every day, but what you see and what you need is like really long-term consistency in the same messaging over and over again, getting better every single time that you do it. And so when you look at something like a TikTok or an Instagram Reel, you're looking at a situation where you have to compete with not just other messages about gambling, positive or negative, but you have to compete with messages about dogs and cats and like anything that would take someone's attention, right? We have a finite amount of attention that we're all fighting for. So what becomes really important is focusing on your hook. And that's the first 1 to 3 seconds, depending on the length of your video, where you have to basically prove to your viewer this is a video worth your time. And that's usually the difference between a pro gambling versus, we'll call them an anti-gambling video. Someone who's streaming slots will put a thing at the top of their thing that says, huge $1 million win, instantly satisfying that hook, right? I'm gonna watch that. I wanna see if he wins or loses $1 million. Whereas with something that I would put out, I have to really think through, like, what will get someone who actually needs help to stop? And this is in getting people into recovery and spreading awareness about the fact that gambling addiction exists. It oftentimes gravitates towards really, really negative things, which is where I empathize with, like, a journalist. Because if I put out a video and I call it so-and-so's inspiring journey to a better life, no one's gonna watch that. But if I put out a video called gambling almost killed her 3 times, all of a sudden, whoa, that's serious, I gotta watch this video. And so I have to walk this tightrope with my content of respecting the subject of my content while also trying to compete with everything else that's out there. And so if I had no morals at all, I'd be very, very famous. But unfortunately, we have to just think, how can we get attention without offending the people? Because at the end of the day, it is, utilizing someone's story to try to get eyes on this project. And so that's a big challenge to everyone. Think about, how can I get people interested in this without just like absolutely abusing the person that's in recovery? That wasn't really tips and tricks, but that's kind of the overview of it. If you need like really technical tips and tricks, I'd almost just recommend watching a YouTube video about it.
No, that's perfect, and I think you're right. The marketplace for eyeballs is very, very tight. Did you, at the beginning of what you were saying, did you say a TikTok, a Meadow, and a Meta? Oh, a Meta. I was going to say, I don't even know what a Meadow is. Okay, TikTok, a Meta, or Google. Yes, okay. We can move on. All right, Michael, I'm going to you now. The rise of YouTube shows, podcasters, that's sort of been just this incredible thing to behold. I'm not really a podcast person. I prefer to read my news, but I am obviously in the minority now. Can you talk a little bit about that world and the importance of engaging there and how to do so the best way?
Yeah, I think this issue in particular, the strategy I'm about to describe is not something I've utilized yet in the gambling space, because I myself am, only in the past year have been like putting out work in this, and so it may be in the future I will utilize what I'm about to describe. But for people in this room who are sort of like established on this issue, and have a perspective, have a story to tell, either to like a wider audience or just to your local community, there are so many podcasts and YouTube shows. Like, everybody and their mother these days is trying to start a podcast, and like you have to know what to search for to find these smaller upstart podcasts all over YouTube, and most of them are on YouTube these days. The podcasts that you find in your podcast app, like most of them will have a YouTube video component. But yeah, like even like some big churches have podcasts, like community colleges have podcasts, colleges have, all colleges have podcasts. Like people are just like trying to get their message out in all of these sort of upstart podcasts. So I would just like search around, and like some of these shows have producers, the sort of bigger ones, the more mid-sized ones. Some of them are just run by the individual who's doing the podcast, interviewing folks. But like, similar to what I said about like, think about reporters' like own self-interest. It's like, if they're trying to put out a weekly podcast, like it's a job for them to book guests and to like think of who to talk to and think of ideas and think of topics. So if you can just cold email some people or find ways to contact them and just say like, hey, this is my voice, this is my perspective. If you have done the sort of part one of like making news, what I described earlier, like even better, like if you have a piece of news or a report or whatever, and you just got a news article, and then you say, hey, I was featured in this news article, I'd love to talk on your show or your YouTube show or your podcast and just tell you more about it. Like, I think that people will find that, shows of a certain size are more receptive to being cold emailed than you would anticipate. And you're really doing them a favor in a lot of these cases, especially for people who are like trying to fill weekly slots or what have you.
That's good. And then I'll give the last official question to Matt, and then I'm not sure if we... A couple questions. Okay, so Matt, this is the last message delivery question. you brought this up when we talked, and I thought it was so important how it used to be that you could get your story, you'd get your story in a major media outlet like New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, and you'd be doing really well. Like that was big time. And now that's not enough anymore. So can you guide us, like where do you go from there and how do you maximize your media opportunities?
So first of all, I think getting media for the sake of it is, obviously it's very difficult to land stories and you have to have a lot of components, and getting coverage is important, but it has to be for a purpose. Like, who are you trying to influence? Who is the decision maker? You've got to link it back to the politics and the public affairs and the lobbying component. Otherwise, it's just going to go out into the ether, and there's going to be no real traction from it. When a story lands now, though, in the mainstream media, whether that's on broadcast or in national newspapers, the follow-up social media aspect is as important. So I think the data that came out yesterday was in the UK, 36% of people get their news just from social media. So they're not seeing the stories in the newspapers or on broadcast. They're seeing the versions that are extrapolated and cut from those stories on their X feed or on Facebook or on Instagram. So having a network, whether that's your own channels as a campaign or individuals that are allied to you, that are influencers with big followings, repurposing that content is such an important component. And I think loads of people now, loads of campaigns are realizing that they're landing these stories, they're spending lots of time and resources getting the story out, and no one's reading it, really. And that's the tragic thing. And then there's no follow-up from it. So the reverberation on social media, creating that echo, super important, and building that infrastructure as well with like influencers that support your campaign, who are going to like repost it and talk about it. And then there's the podcast network that's been touched on. Like, there's just so many things that should be emanating from that story when it lands as part of the media strategy.
I think that's so wise, just clipping what you get in the Wall Street Journal and then posting it on your social media, or asking Rob to share it with his 15 million followers a week, or taking your podcast show and then reclipping it and getting it out. That's super important. So I think Les said we have time for a couple.
Yes, we do. So I just have a quick question as I start going to the audience for all of you. To me, one of the, and this is what really in many ways drives me on this issue. So we spent much of the forum framing this as a kind of public health and the addiction, the harm that it causes people. But this issue, like the whole issue of predatory gambling, is without a doubt like the most neglected major economic justice issue in our country. The American people are losing $300,000 every minute to this industry, to this institution. So quick question for you all, like how would we start to frame this issue? Beyond just we need to focus on those who are suffering major public health harm, but how do we also begin to frame it as like, you care about, if you're on the left, you care about wealth inequality, like this is your issue. If you're on the right and you care about strengthening economic well-being of families, like this is your issue. And so we have not done a good enough job. So part of the reason why we call this is taxation by exploitation. Half of it's about the public health harm, but half of it is about trapping hundreds of millions, tens of millions of Americans in poverty. So just want any advice on framing it as an economic justice issue as well. So for anybody.
So I think it comes back to what we were talking about yesterday. Like, there's no seatbelt moment for gambling. It's really, really hard to raise empathy for someone with a gambling addiction that's after the fact. You made the mistake, you made the bad decision, you were weak, you were a bad gambler. Like, these are the kinds of comments, right? It's not like a ASPCA commercial where you see a sad dog in black and white and then you send money and donate it in, right? It's like, it's just the truth.
But my point is, beyond just people who have been addicted to it, who suffer financial harm, it's just the person spending $200 a week. I know, just who may not be addicted, but just keeping them in poverty and keeping that. That's more that, kind of that piece of it.
Yeah. I still think that's difficult because it still feels like it's an easy out to say that's their choice, even if it's systemic things driving them to it, which is why we need to find, I think it's going to be kids, I really do. Like, everyone can come to the conclusion that like a 12-year-old kid doesn't have the cognitive function to know what is good and bad about, like, I'm going to spend money on this versus that. If we can use them as the framing mechanism before they develop an addiction, that's where you can build empathy. So say, like, this is what's going to happen to this kid over the next 10 years. I think that's stronger than saying this is what happened to me over the last 10 years.
You just have a couple quick.
I was going to say that the economics of the sector, I mean, I think that's a really important point, and the money's got to come from somewhere. I mean, everyone's talking about yesterday about the tax revenues or the, you know, all that kind of stuff. That's because people are spending money on gambling that they're not then spending on other things.
Right.
So, but I would make that kind of analysis, that economic analysis, as local as possible. So, you know, what's been the knock-on impact on other sectors, on other restaurants or whatever?
Well, I'm not even, I'm talking like as individual families, the individual well-being of families. So, all right, I'm going to questions in the audience.
Could I?
Russ Cole. Oh, yeah, go ahead, Matt.
Yeah, I was just going to say briefly. So, in terms of answering the question of like whether you're making an economic justice pitch, whether you're making a well-being of families pitch, like the question of what's going to make it stick for people, you know, I've reached out to, you know, a bunch of groups in the past, you know, few months after we put out our first report and had conversations with people, you know, people on the right, people on the left, and I have really not encountered a situation where I'm making one of those pitches to people and they've not agreed that it's a like compelling pitch. I think what I've come to believe is the biggest issue that I think we face in like getting this issue to stick to people, like once they hear that pitch, whether it be, you know, appealing to their views on the right or the left, like what's going to make them actually like start doing something on the issue is, I think that there are like hundreds of thousands, infinite problems in the world that people can care about, and like I feel like our brains have difficulty like accepting a new one in as to be like, this is the one I'm going to care about at this moment, if they are not presented with the solution to fix it as they are being pitched on what that problem is. And so, you know, I've had conversations where I've done a basically the sky is falling pitch to people, and they've said, this is bad, I agree with you, I agree with your argument about how it should appeal to my political sensibilities, and then it's like crickets from them going forward, because it's like, I don't really feel like I've presented them the solution, and so their brain's just gonna be like, okay, I'm gonna move on to the other issue that I'm concerned about that I do find a solution for. So, you know, I think it's incumbent on us, and like this is why we're obviously having the discussions around regulation versus you know, abolition, but it's like, I think getting to the point of saying, here's the problem, here's one proposed solution, I think it is important in getting people to say like, okay, I'm gonna carry that forward.
I'm looking for tips and suggestions. I frequently deal with reporters who have a mindset of inevitability, that it's inevitable that gambling expansion is gonna come to Texas. So their headline, for example, will be, will 2025 finally be the year where casinos are expanded in Texas? Do you have any suggestions? And that narrative is in the ethos. Any suggestions for how to counter that narrative?
So I would look at all of the negative impacts on the other states and say we need to, like, you need to, I think, reframe it as something that needs to be resisted. Look at the negative impact on every state that's legalized iGaming, all of the increase in number of helpline calls, all of the increase in like demand for services, how much has been lost, the economic impact, the negative economic impact because that money's been taken away from other sectors, and then create a we must resist this like kind of narrative in Texas rather than, yeah, we're going to finally get this thing.
I think this is far easier said than done, but like I think the reason why that happens, especially in headlines, I mean, headlines these days are the worst, the clickbaity stuff that they do. But, you know, I think the idea of news reporters focusing on the new, it's like there is a bias towards like, what is gonna change? Like, is this gonna change? So if you're in a state where it's currently illegal, they're gonna be like, is there going to be something new? And the something new inevitably would only be that it gets legalized. So like, if you can present some sort of counter narrative of like, well, here's a change in the other direction of we are, you know, getting even more opposed to it or something. It's not an easy thing to do when you're up against such like a clear contrast. But if you can find a way to like say, here's something new, but presents the issue in a way where we have momentum going this way, then.
Yeah, as a professional clickbaiter, I would say if I was to write a YouTube video title, I don't know how helpful this will be for you. That was the opposite of that. I'd say the horrible things that will happen in 2026 if it's legalized. So just a direct counter to like, okay, if it is legalized, here's what's actually going to happen, which is kind of getting into like the data we looked at yesterday.
I just
like
feel
that
like
a-
that's the normal pitch I would give even without the narrative. That's the struggle I have.
I like that a lot, but I've lobbied in Texas a little bit, so I've kind of seen how it's done, and I know that you all like to do things your own way. So if I were there lobbying with you, I'd probably frame it as Texans continue to stand together strong against a multi-billion-dollar out-of-state industry that wants our money, kind of thing.
Thank you.
I would say we, at some point, we have a whole set of topics. We get that all the time. We actually have topics. I don't want to take time now, but we have a whole set of topics. Inevitability argument, which is a phony narrative driven by the industry. Yes.
You young men yesterday, I think, hit on something that was so significant, and I know we've got so much information, but it seemed as if it sort of faded away instantly. Having grown up with 3 brothers and raised a son with my husband and have 2 grandsons, we should keep all these different arguments and narratives going about, let's said, the moral argument before it's even political, but that's kind of for people that have weathered the storm a bit to say, yeah, we see why this is moral. I know my grandson right now, I've been thinking about him this whole time. He's only 9, but they're so plugged into everything, and anything that is a competition that's on a device. We had them at one of those Topgolf type things at the PGA place in Frisco, and he was so wired in to how he did on the hitting of the golf ball, and I applaud that. That's male and competition. I'm not saying women don't have that, but I don't want that stopped. But to me, you hit on, if guys your age, and clearly you all are so bright and got hooked in, they know that. They know that's part of what you want, so they add, where can we hook them in with all this competition, and I'm the winner and I'm the king of the hill. But it was the idea of, you're an idiot, because, and I don't mean calling names, but that, just like you said, they immediately go, oh, well, you didn't win because you're a loser. Well, because they're not imagining this is going to happen to them. And so to me, it's so powerful that you all are so bright and young and look the part, and you had some tough times there, and you hit on that idea of, let's market it as you are being scammed. And we all, at my age, it's don't fall for losing your mortgage and for people scamming older people to give to the wildlife fund and they clean out their savings. It's that kind of thing. I think there's a lot to be said to convince the guy, don't be an idiot. So why can't you do an ad like the Apple Watch that is those voices of people really calling after they've lost to say, help me, I'm losing my home, help me, and I know this is maybe older people, my wife's leaving me, help me, I didn't mean to just beat my wife up and all. And it's all about those things, and then it's don't fall for the scam of online gambling.
Definitely. I think thank you very much for that. That was brilliant contribution. The gambling industry wants to control the messaging around responsible gambling because they want to put the type of advertisements out that sort of say, stay in control, set limits, and like sort of tell people how to gamble responsibly, quote unquote. Whereas actually, what we need is a public information campaign about the fact that the reality of the industry, about the reality of the thing that's being marketed to them, deceptively, the deceptive way in which the gambling industry tries to acquire new customers. And that can only really come from independently commissioned kind of, yeah.
I would say it's almost solely a money problem,
Yeah.
Rather than an intention problem. I have like 10 commercials that I've written basically to that extent, but my total budget, I just got 4 billboards in Philly that are going to go up for the baseball playoffs. My total budget was $1,500. And we're looking at an industry that puts $1,500 a minute into their team that sits and records a professional advertising and puts it up, right? If we had $100 million, we'd put ads up that run like that. That makes sense. But the only counter messaging that we see is gambling is neither good nor bad. Call us if you have a problem. Who's going to respond to that? No one, but that's where the money is. And it's the unfortunate reality.
We're going to wind down here, but I just want to say what they just mentioned, like this idea of a public information campaign is certainly needed. I just want to highlight, you need to do a public information campaign about what is a government program here in the United States. Like that's what we're talking, like against our own government. Like that's what we're talking, funding a public information campaign about what is a government policy. So that's what we're talking about. It's not about it. It's, the industry partners with government to be legal. So I just want that's the incredible hypocrisy that exists here. That I just want to highlight because it's just I can't think of another issue where we need to run a public information campaign against something our own government is doing. So with that, we're going to wrap up. We're going to bring up the prediction markets next. We're going to move on. But you guys will be around through 1, and they'll be available by email and so on.